Yeah, so last week we got a basic introduction, and one of the handouts was a big, nice picture of topography of the area. And I will admit to have taken a lot of geography for granted. And then this past week, and even just this week, I've been kind of crash coursing on the geographic realities of the Holy Lands, of the Middle East, of the area we're talking about. So before we go too deep into that, one of the general questions I would have is, what is the normal direction that you go when you want to do something outside of E-Town? What's the most popular, easy city you get to?
Lancaster.
Yeah,
Harrisburg.
yeah, Harrisburg, right. It's one of those two. And so there's a little bit of a difference between those two cities. And how far is it?
18 miles both ways.
Isn't York the same too?
It is.
Yeah.
That's why we live here.
And so is your first answer mileage or time?
I was gonna say 20 minutes to
Yep.
Lancaster.
There it is.
Depends where you live.
It does. But I just wanted to quickly illustrate that when you think of distance, your first instinct is to think about time. And we have kind of, the reality of cars allows us to bring a whole lot more distance into our world than they ever could. And so the thought of me walking home from here is a very different prospect than driving. And me walking home is going to be way easier than almost anybody else in this room. Except maybe you, but even there, I don't even have to cross a busy road. So there's that. And so walking is the reality of the time we're talking about. And that puts a really hard scale for us to comprehend. It just becomes difficult to think about walking to Hershey, walking to Lancaster, or walking to Harrisburg, much less crossing the river. And so the other two aspects I want to throw out there as we look at this map very quickly, and just generally speaking, you have the Mediterranean Sea. And so that was a natural barrier that was immovable, and it's also one that the Israelites almost avoided year after year after year. I mean, decade, century after century. And one of the reasons they did that, number one, they were not natural seafaring people. They just weren't. The other thing is that this coastal plain was it was a trade route, and so it was always controlled by the people who controlled trading. And that was never the Israelites, except maybe during the time of Solomon. And so the Philistines lived there. They controlled that during the popular David and Saul years. And most major empires would control that trading route because that's where. And so Israel was always, again, except for a very, very short period of time, a secondary power, a minor power in the scheme of world politics, in the scheme of life. And yet, this area is sadly in the news because it's just part of our history and involves people groups that aren't going to go anywhere and want to be part of what's happening here. We're no longer part of that, but it shapes how God created the people and how he had to start with a people that would end up being worldwide. But still, the fact that it was started local and started with the people that were never going to be powerful. And so that's kind of a challenge to me as I think about Christianity and who are we as Christians, and can we accept being not powerful? Again, there's all kinds of nuances there, but tonight we're going to focus on geography. So I would say let's go ahead and look at the next video, and then
Sure.
and
And
go from there.
I have a theory about York as well, and that is, I think the river is a psychological barrier. There's a bridge, or several bridges that go across from Lancaster County to York County, but I just don't think of York right away. And I mean, they root for the Baltimore Ravens over there. It's just a whole other land.
It's chickens. I'm from Baltimore.
But I just think the river plays some kind of I think,
Yeah.
some kind of role.
Well, quickly going back to this, you have the Jordan River, which also plays a similar type of role in that world that would have been.
Was it a major river? Jordan?
That,
Sure.
I'm not sure, I don't know how to describe it, because it's not, is it a major river? No, but was it a major feature of the geography?
Well,
Yes.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
So you could walk across it, or you had to have a boat?
I think it depended on the season, I think it depended on the location.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of it.
It's a very fertile plain. The
Right,
Jordan River Valley
yes.
Yeah.
is, for a time, they were the most powerful place with Fertile Crescent,
Yeah.
briefly. But the Jordan River Valley is wet, and it's way low,
Yes.
which
and that's-
also means the sun doesn't fry everything. I don't think you can get a sunburn like down by the Dead Sea, because there's so much atmosphere. So it's very temperate, it's very green, it's where a lot of the cattle were grown during the Fertile Crescent time.
So one of the things we pointed out last week was that the highest point in Lancaster County is only about 11 or 1,200 feet. The Dead Sea is lower, below sea level than that. It's 1,500 feet below sea level. And so it's down there. And even the Sea of Galilee up here in the north is below sea level. That was news to me. I did not realize that even the Sea of Galilee was below sea level. And so that in and of itself does all kinds of weird things. And so because this is so low, and then the mountain ridge of the hill country just west of there creates a natural barrier. And then, one last little thing is that there's canyons cut
Yeah,
all
so
through
that-
this.
I
And
can see that.
it becomes very difficult to, traveling in a straight line is not possible. I mean, you can do it, but you have to be lucky to choose the right straight line to follow.
And there's no natural ports.
No, right.
Until the Romans built Caesarea, there were no ports. You would actually get onto Egypt or come in Aqaba to get to that land.
Okay, thank you.
So, for those who weren't here last week, we started with sort of two answers to the question why biblical geography is important. And one of them was because God, in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, as one author says, chose a parking spot. He chose a time about 2,000 years ago, at a place in the Middle East, and Jesus weighed a certain amount and had dark curly hair and dark skin, and he chose a particular point in history to come in the incarnation. And so because of that, the Bible was written to us, but through a particular culture and language and in a certain place. And so when we read the Bible, it's actually a cross-cultural experience. And so we need to immerse ourselves in that place and in that time in order to better understand and then to better receive God's Word. So that's partly why we want to do this. And so tonight, we're getting beyond the why, we're going to get to context. And the Fertile Crescent was already brought up tonight. You get to see that in the two videos we have here, short videos. And then next week, we'll actually start to get to the features of the Holy Land. And that's my favorite video, my favorite part. But tonight is also good. So let's take a look. And again, these videos come to us from the Satellite Bible Atlas, which I passed around last week. And I just really appreciate their videos. The videos are a little bit more monotone and a little bit drier than Dr. John Beck, who's our Daily Bread guest teacher. So you'll get to see both, but I really appreciate the context that this gives. So here goes.
So what are some things that struck you as you listened to those two videos? What were you reminded of, or what are some things about geography that are now coming before in light of what you heard?
One thing, 900 miles is a very long walk.
Yes.
Even for a camel.
Yeah. Again, the sense of scale is just really hard to translate meaningfully from a walking world to a driving world.
Now, did the path go through the Jordan Valley, or do you go along the Mediterranean further too?
Mediterranean, yeah. That was the more popular, easier way to go. And that's why it was almost always controlled by the empires.
Okay, so Israel is on the other side of the mountains from the Mediterranean coast.
Well, it was also just, it was part of the hill country just off the coast.
And we'll have another whole video on routes and roads in the Holy Land. So,
Still a lot of trade going on through those channels with
Yes.
now canals and shipping and everything these
Right.
days, but still through that area.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like, I mean, not seems, we've actually definitely transitioned from being a land trade route world to a much more sea and airplane, but seas in particular, ocean liner exchangers.
But it's still sort of a crossroads there.
I heard the first video say that even though it's a small land, the Lord has used it in big ways. And that shows his power and his might through the people of Israel.
So for most of its history, there were no animals, and there were no wheels, there were no carts, right? So it started off as a sea trade along the rivers,
On the rivers.
at the Nile,
Yes.
Tigris, and the Euphrates,
Right.
and then out into the world. This is focused on Israel when Israel was Israel. So it really kind of,
Yeah.
just to put it in a time box, this is talking about when Israel arrives here,
Right.
because it was only a little before that that you actually had land routes,
Okay.
where people weren't carrying it on their backs, and it was donkeys, not camels.
Right.
But the point is then, so the world had changed, and so where God put them on the land routes, 500 years, 1,000 years earlier would have meant nothing.
Right.
But where he planted them was right on the land routes after that became possible.
Yeah.
Because the sea was a good place to lose everything.
Yes, and if you read the Psalms, it's repeated many, many times, that the sea is a good place to lose everything. And the Proverbs repeat the same thing. Yeah, I guess the other thing that struck me as I was thinking about the land and our understanding of history is that we often associate Israel with this land, and yet, as Daniel just mentioned, the time of Israel that we think of Israel is truly just King David, King Saul, David, Solomon. And then after that, things started to fall apart pretty quickly. And even under Saul, they only controlled, quote, the hill country, not everything else. And there were generations of family history that tied this land to the Israelite people. But when they left, when Jacob and his family went to Egypt, there were 70 of them. And it was only when they came out of that this land became Israel. And then with the divided kingdom, it didn't take long for more empires to rise up and usurp this land. And so I keep going back to the fact that somehow God used people that were never very strong to influence a world that is now coming to terms with that, as we are coming to terms with the loss of influence. So,
I always thought that area was flat and desert.
okay.
And you keep saying hill country, I'm going, hills?
Yes.
Next week, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. So again, we'll show some more videos which actually shows photography and topography, and so you can actually see it. Yeah, and I'll repeat again one of the comments I made last week. So, as we just mentioned, the Dead Sea was like 3,800 feet below sea level. So if you start at the foothills of the Dead Sea and walk up to Jerusalem, which isn't very far, it's just right here, that is a mile in elevation that you're going up. So it's not a mile-high city, but it's a mile above the level of the Dead Sea. Yeah, and so that kind of hill terrain is also something we have a hard time comprehending because we live here in the east. And so the thought of a mountain that's a mile high just doesn't exist around here.
Earlier, you said the Dead Sea was 1,500 feet
And-
below sea level.
No, Pennsylvania is 1,500 feet at its height. Lancaster County is 1,500 feet above.
But that, the Dead Sea is 3,800
I
feet?
believe, yeah, but it's something you can look up, so, sorry. Yeah,
And the Sea of Galilee in the north
Right.
is 700 feet, starts at 700 feet below sea level, and the Jordan River descends from there
Right.
to the Dead Sea.
yeah. Yes. So, I'm sorry, Jerusalem is 3,800 feet above. Yeah, and then the other little detail, for what it's worth, is from the Sea of Galilee in the north down to the Dead Sea in the south is, in terms of overall distance, is about the same as from here to the border of New York State. Yeah. So, the other thing that, to kind of contextualize our world to that world is, some of it was already alluded to when you talked about crossing the river, but even in terms of what's the first thing you think of as different people groups that aren't far away, whether it's a typical person from Lebanon, or from Harrisburg, or from, quote, the other side of the river. I mean, you have images of people, of how they live, what's important to them, how they talk, what they say. And so all of that would have been true of this people also. And because it was a trade route, it attracted all kinds of immigrants. And because we live in Lancaster County, we're used to lots of immigrants. It's not quite the same, because few of them came to live there. They were just passing through, whereas people now come to live here, which is nice. But it exposed you to a whole different group of people and begins to explain some of the references in the Bible. Again, we talked last week, what good can come from Nazareth, because it had a reputation, as opposed to the Sea of Galilee, or people who were fishermen, which also has a reputation. Fishermen versus,
If you look at Israel, it is really in the center of the major different empires. And to go from Africa to Asia,
no choice.
that's the way. If you want to go from Europe to Africa, at that time, that was the way, or to Asia.
Yeah, even to get to Asia, it wasn't much of a detour. And you almost had to come south toward the top
had
of this
to-
map before you could go back.
Right. But the other route to Asia is around the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, that's a sea
Yeah.
route that was,
There was no Suez Canal.
no, no. One other thing that struck me last time was when Moses did come back and led the people, he was actually, he came from the, quote, other side. So he also avoided the popular route to get to the promised land. And so again, it feels like these people knew they needed to keep a low profile and didn't want to attract too much attention, even as they were, quote, claiming the promised land. So they actually came on the desert side of the Sea of Galilee to get to the promised land. And Moses actually helped conquer several parts of the territory that became Israel proper before he finally said goodbye in Deuteronomy and handed off the reins to Joshua.
Where's the wilderness they traveled around in circles in for 40 years?
Further south of this, so I believe it's
Yeah.
south of,
Yep. I could try to find something here.
it's south of the Dead Sea.
Yeah, it's not pictured on this screen right now.
So how large of a landmass are we talking here? Like how many miles from one end to the other? And you know, how wide?
the width is probably almost, did they say 50
If you look
miles?
at that map, there's a scale,
Yeah.
that the previous map that was up. And the last map has, it's very
Yes.
small, actually.
Right, the next video will have 150 miles north to south and 45 miles, depends where you measure,
Right.
roughly 45 miles across. So it's really not that big. So, again, the Satellite Bible Atlas has a page on the wilderness.
There it is, right there.
Wilderness down, they would have come, actually, let's see. The Exodus might show the traditional Mount Sinai. There we go. So the wandering would have happened throughout here, and then they would have come up the east side of the Dead Sea, and then crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land.
So they stayed on, looking at the map, the right side all the way down.
All the way up,
Well,
and then crossed over the Jordan River into Israel.
Is this where they,
That's where they actually crossed.
yeah, this is Moses' little trick.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the crossing of the Red Sea was down here. So that's why when they left Egypt, the Egyptians thought they were confused and sort of dead end.
You were right, just trying to.
And, you know, some of this they cannot be sure about, so I think the traditional Mount Sinai would be here, but according to that crossing, would Sinai be somewhere over here?
Yeah, in Arabia. The problem was Egypt owned the whole Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
If you stayed there, you died there. They had armies, they had outposts, they had forts. So Moses had to get out of there, and by crossing at the further southern end, which is the latest theory, he gets out of Egypt, because the whole Sinai Peninsula belonged to Egypt, and they could have hit the Israelites from anywhere.
I don't know how much, Dan, you've talked about some of the recent archaeological work that's been going on, and it continues to reinforce what the Bible's been telling us forever and ever. And it confounds the people who are truly surprised that what was written was actually true. Again, the irony is, as you look at ancient religious historical writings, the Bible stands out as such a contrast. I mean, it's talking about people that make sense. Abraham and others who were part of that whole historical. And now we have more and more evidence that it truly was historical and not just folk tales. When you think about true ancient religions, most of them are just fantastical stories of gods doing crazy things, having lots and lots of wars. And so the other part of what I really appreciate about the Bible is that God was a gardener in his creation. His Garden of Eden was when he invited his people to be part of a garden project. And so no other religion talks about their most powerful God being a gardener first, or a farmer first.
And I think the third part about the why, which is kind of related to the other two parts we talked about last week, is that, and I think the first video said that we study this because this was a real place with real people. And so, you know, some of the other religions don't have that. They don't have God condescending and taking on flesh and joining us here. So again, it's that incarnation. So that's the reason we do this. We talked about doing some metaphorical push-ups and sit-ups, and that's the reason I gave you these maps last week. So number one is, and you said Bethlehem, and it is. It's down by the Dead Sea. All right?
Below Jerusalem.
That's right, just south of Jerusalem. Okay, so, and what you could do here is mark these numbers as we go through them, and I'd like you to know them by next week, okay? These are easy. These are easy. So, Bethlehem, number 6 is the next one. Does anyone know what number 6 is? Capernaum. Well done.
Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Capernaum. Yep,
Yeah, it's way up here.
that's the one I was pointing to as Bethlehem. All right, number 8. Number 8,
Dead Sea
That's the
itself.
Dead Sea.
Dead Sea. And when you do this quiz, half of the time we'll be looking for the number.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Number 9,
Mediterranean.
Mediterranean Sea. Number 10 and 11, these are 2 of the same.
They were up where Nazareth.
That's right.
used to be.
Yes, so it's an upper and a lower what? Upper and lower Galilee, yes. 10 and 11. The next one, number 19.
That's Jerusalem is above Bethlehem.
Number 22. So according to your key, the underlines are valleys, and then this is not, has no notation, so it's just a body.
It's that
river
green
itself.
area.
That's right,
The
the river
river.
itself.
Dead Sea.
Jordan River.
Jordan River.
All of that?
22.
No, 22, yeah. 23. And this is whose comment? Who said desert? Susan said desert, but instead Israel has a lot of, Judean hill country.
So near Bethlehem.
Yep, well, it's the region around where Bethlehem is found.
Yeah.
So it's the Judean hill country. Similar to that, number 24, it's another region.
You call it the wilderness.
Yes, the Judean wilderness. Okay, now we have some mountains. Number 30. This is towards the north, along the coast.
Oh, yeah, you can see the snow on the top of that mountain.
Well, that's 31
No.
you might be looking at.
Oh.
30 is along the
Oh,
coast.
no.
So what mountain is that?
Oh,
And then
oh.
Carmel.
Mount Carmel, yep. Number 31. That now it's
That's where
yours.
the snow is.
That's
All the
where
way
snow
north.
is.
Yes, so what's the name of that one?
Herman.
Herman.
Mount Herman, well done. Okay. And number 33. This is near the Sea of Galilee.
That's right.
33 is,
Nazareth. Right near the Sea of Galilee.
That's right.
yeah,
Nazareth.
It's right there.
southwest of the Sea of Galilee. It's a mountain area.
Number,
Under Lower Galilee.
number 37. This is again a region.
Samaria.
The region in between Galilee and
It's the hill
Judea.
country.
Yes, yes, also in the hill country. Yep. Number 38.
The Sea of
Sea
Galilee.
of Galilee, and that's the first 15. So if you marked those, you wouldn't have to worry about the rest until the next week. And if you can get those, that's a great start. And that's actually really good. But there's a lot more detail we can go into.
And if we make the grade, we can come to follow.
Yes, if you make the grade.
Okay.
Now, speaking of making the grade, I thought Elaine was pretty sharp on that little quiz, so I have a prize for her. And since we studied the Fertile Crescent tonight, I got you. But oh yeah, that's only if you bake them and bring them back to serve.
Well, then I have to give them back.
We don't have an oven.
You don't have
We
enough.
don't have a
Oh.
kitchen.
Oh. Well, maybe find a cute little server.
We have some friends that can.
Okay. So-
We're in the penthouse at the Sonic home.
Okay.
We have nice view. And the bed.
So, again, last week it was a lot about the why. Tonight was more about the context of the Fertile Crescent and the nations and the empires around. But next week we'll get into the Holy Land proper and look at just the great variety within this small little land, 150 by 45. And we'll continue and learn 15 more next week. So, thanks, Eric.